to order, and welcome to meeting number 16 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10th, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings. Members and witnesses participating virtually may speak in the official language of your choice. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk will advise the chair on whose hands are up to the best of his ability, and we will do the best that we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, brackets 2, and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 17th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the rise of ideologically motivated violent extremism in Canada. With us today by video conference as an individual, Aurélie Campana, full professor, Mubin Shaikh, counter-extremist specialist, and from Insight Threat Intelligence, Jessica Davis, president and principal consultant. Up to 5 minutes for each of our witnesses to proceed with opening remarks and then rounds of questions. Given the technologies at the moment, I'm going to start with Mr. Shaikh. You have 5 minutes for an opening comment, sir. The floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you. Just going to start my stopwatch. Good afternoon, Honorable Chair and members of the committee. It is in gratitude and service that I respectfully accepted the invite to appear before you today. My name is Mubin Shaikh. I'm a former undercover human source for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and later with RCMP INSET, responsible for the Toronto 18 terrorism case of 2006. I had worked several other investigations prior to that, which cannot be made public, but today I conduct direct interventions with radicalized individuals from across the ideological spectrum under the US-based organization parentsforpeace.org, and I'm currently a professor of public safety at Seneca College in Toronto. Just to go off script for a moment for the translators, in an incredible moment of coincidence or kismet, fellow members of Parents for Peace are currently, right now as we speak, giving testimony in the U.S. House Committee on Veterans Affairs to discuss the topic of radicalization in the military. And so I submit that today's discussion is very timely. Back to my script. I have had the unique experience to have viewed threats to Canadian public safety and national security from direct participation in covert activities, but also 4 years of public prosecution of such offenses in our courts between 2006 to 2010 inclusive. Afterwards, between 2014 to 2018, we went through the Khawarij of ISIS crisis. We saw social media platforms become force multipliers for violent actors, and conversations around preventing and countering radicalization, extremism, and terrorism grew into important areas of study and practice, and for good reason. Today, I appear before you to address the issue of IMVE, or ideologically motivated violent extremism, and what can be done about it. I submit to you that we have come somewhat full circle in Canada regarding a threat that some may erroneously take to be quote unquote new, which it is most certainly not. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service, only 5 years after its formation, was already working to infiltrate the neo-Nazi group called the Heritage Front, established in 1989. Using tried, tested, and true TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, CSIS was able to foil the ability of the front to become what it had envisioned for itself, and the organization ultimately collapsed. It is thus unsurprising to me today that security agencies have once again turned their sights onto such organizations and associations, loosely knit or otherwise, while also keeping a watchful eye on the usual suspects, state-based or not. One of the biggest lessons learned from this is not just how much is being supported and agitated from outside actors, but worse is how much is being generated organically right here at home with Canadians highly active in online hate networks. I have read the submission of various representatives of Canadian security agencies in terms of how they see the threat and their response to it. I am more than confident that they are up to the task and support fully strengthening their staffing and operational ability to do what works in this context. I respectfully submit that it is for government agencies and departments to do their part in conducting covert investigations and public prosecutions, and for civil society to do its part as well. On the latter, this will require educational institutions, places of employment, places of businesses, and others to invest the energy to try to prevent trajectories of violent extremism where possible. When it comes to ideas, however, no amount of government legislation or criminal designation is going to suffice. It is here that we will require a collective effort by professionals and practitioners in all areas to bring to bear their concern and attention in pushing back against absolutist, superficial, supremacist thinking as unwelcome, unsustainable, and frankly impractical for life in this cosmopolitan future we live in here in Canada and the world at large. I thank the Honorable Chair and members of the committee for allowing me this time, my co-panelists as well, and I look forward to any questions, concerns, and or comments that you may have. Thank you.
Much. I would now like to call on Aurélie Campana, full professor, for 5 minutes of an opening remark. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, thank you warmly for the invitation to appear before this committee. My name is Aurélie Campana. I'm a professor of political science at Laval University, and for the past 20 years I've been interested in violent extremism, first by studying jihadism, particularly in Russia and the Sahel, and then by examining the Canadian far right. The field work that my colleagues Samuel Tanner from the Université de Montréal, Stéphane Lemont-Langlois from Laval University, and I conducted began in 2013, at a time when the Canadian far right was still not very visible. We were thus able to follow the evolution of this movement as its constituent groups became more visible in the public space. I'd like to share some observations from our scientific findings on two interrelated issues: global scope and the role of social media. Before doing so, I would like to make two preliminary remarks. First, there are two trends within what is commonly referred to as the Canadian far right. First, groups and individuals who belong to the radical right. Second, those who make up the far right. The first group aims to bring about fundamental reform of the state and society by returning to the ideological roots of political action. Marked by a very strong heterogeneity, radical right-wing groups and individuals tend to conform to the rules of the political game, claiming to want to transform them from within. Most defend democracy as an organising principle, but reject liberal democracy and its underlying values, including pluralism and egalitarianism. Extremist parties and groups, on the other hand, reject the democratic system and clearly question its legitimacy and that of the state. They call for an overthrow, sometimes by violence, of the structures in place. These groups, fringe groups, invest in the public space, sometimes in an uncomplicated way. I understand that you're mainly interested in extremist groups and individuals. However, those who are categorized as radical deserve sustained attention because they contribute to the trivialization of a message, whether it is Islamophobic or anti-system, and can indirectly constitute recruitment belts. Secondly, the far right-wing movement represents an ecosystem with shifting boundaries. This movement is made up of groups, intellectuals, alternative media of various sizes, but also of individuals, some of whom emerge as influencers. I speak about changing borders because the groups and individuals who are part of it can widen their discursive repertories by trying to phagocytize marginal fringe movements like that of the incels, whose theories are similar to those of the ideological springs which they mobilize here in masculinism. Some issues, which are salient at a given moment may say the importance diminish from time to time or more sustainably. Thus, during the 2010s, many groups and individuals of the radical right and extreme far right have emerged around issues of identity. If the racist, Islamophobic and anti-Semitic character of the discourse they carry is far from having disappeared, it is now taking a back seat to the anti-sanitary measures discourse and rhetoric, but above all to an anti-elite and anti-system discourse. Both groups and individuals of the radical right and those belonging to the far right are inserted into networks with international ramifications. Social media make possible a convergence of rhetoric which does not necessarily call for formal context, but can be seen through the sharing of certain ideological references or interpretation of a crisis, such as the health crisis, for example. Today, if the rhetoric of the Canadian radical far right is plural, it converges around four central characteristics which are found in terms sometimes very similar in the rhetoric of American, French, and British movements. These four characteristics are nativism, the victimization of the silent majority, white supremacism, and conspiracy. Such a convergence can be structured. A transnational community or communities of belief emerge, which can give rise to more formal connections. Individuals, know-how, rhetoric, theories, but also money circulate. Social media constitute the space in which the transnationalization of this movement is largely operationalized. And contrary to popular belief, they do not relay a particular rhetoric, but order it, edit it, select it, and tailor it to our needs through recommendation algorithms that claim to know our preferences. Through these algorithms, they create echo chambers that facilitate identification with a particular clause. They are also the place where rumours circulate, which can contribute to rallying individuals whose beliefs have not yet crystallised, but who are vulnerable, but who wonder about, for example, decisions related to the far right. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
I would now like to ask Jessica Davis, President and Principal Consultant of the Insight Threat Intelligence Group, for a 5-minute introduction. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm glad that the committee is undertaking this important study. I'd like to take a few minutes to outline how I see the IMVE threat in Canada with a focus on the financial component. Terrorist and extremist financing uses similar methods and mechanisms across ideologies. Over the last 20 years, we've seen...
Point of order. There's no...
I don't have any interpretation, Mr. Chairperson.
No interpretation. Shall we try again? C'est d'accord?
Are we agreed?
Yep, continue. Go ahead.
Thank you. So terrorist and extremist financing uses similar methods and mechanisms across ideologies. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a shift away from large-scale financing in the West for terrorist activity. Instead, attacks are primarily self-financed and for very small sums of money. Despite these small sums, money remains a key enabler of terrorist activity. Efforts to constrain terrorist and extremist access to funds constrains their capabilities. We see evidence of this in the adoption of low-complexity lone actor attacks, from the October 2014 attacks to the Quebec mosque attacks to the more recent incel-motivated van and stabbing attacks that took place in Toronto. All of these were self-financed attacks that involved no international transfer of funds and likely raised little in the way of suspicion with banks and other financial institutions charged with efforts to detect terrorist financing. But they all required some financial resources, small though they might have been. The one aspect of financing that is different in the IMVE space from other forms of terrorism and extremism is the issue of propaganda. IMVE actors produce propaganda, including in Canada, that serves to recruit people into their movements. Propaganda also inspires lone actors and creates a sense of community for those who would go on to commit ideologically inspired attacks. The propaganda produced by these actors has an important financial component. Extremist influencers can generate significant revenue from this activity. This is important because many of them, particularly those that are successful at generating audiences and particularly hateful propaganda, are often financially excluded from society. They tend to lose their jobs when their views become public knowledge. So that propaganda production sustains them economically. At the moment, we have few tools at our disposal to prevent people from profiting from hate. Deplatforming, whether it's from a social media platform or a financial tool, usually leads to the propagandist influencer finding another platform. Many financial service providers, including payment processors and financial technology companies, rarely restrict the use of their services for hateful content. Most only take action when faced with significant public backlash, if at all. In some cases, Canadian companies appear to provide financial services to sites selling propaganda and goods for listed terrorist entities like the Proud Boys. Compounding this problem is the fact that we have no laws against extremist financing and few laws that can be used to prevent individuals from profiting from that hateful content. And influencer activity rarely rises to the level of terrorism as defined in our criminal code. Between the self-financing of most IMVE attacks and financing of IMVE propaganda, we have some challenges ahead of us. Our terrorist financing tools were adopted following 9/11 with an eye to combating structured terrorist organizations involved in international financing, not lone actors drawing inspiration from extremist influencers. That's not to say that those tools are powerless. Financial intelligence, for example, remains an important tool for law enforcement and security services. But we also need new tools, regulatory flexibility, and investigative expertise to fully tackle the threat of ideologically motivated violent extremism. And we'll need to work with our partners in other countries and with the private sector to do that, since both the threat and its financing, as we saw recently with the convoy, are international in scope. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, and you won't have long to wait for that. We'll go right into our first round of questions, a 6-minute round, and I'll start with Ms. Dancho. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witnesses for giving us their time today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing their expertise, and I thank them for their hard work on this important issue. I'd like to talk a little bit about the demographics that we're seeing in some of the extremist movements. Often, to me on the news, it seems mostly young men. You rarely seem to see women. I just would like to have your comments on why that might be. Is my assessment accurate? Is it mostly young men, or is that just sort of what we hear most about for whatever reason? Just would like to get individual feedback on that from each of our witnesses. Perhaps Ms. Davis can go first.
Great, thank you very much. So on the issue of the gender distribution in ideologically motivated violent extremism, I would say that women's roles are underrepresented in media, so we tend to see them less in terms of reporting, but I would estimate that their participation is on par with other forms of terrorism and extremism, so somewhere in the 15 to 30% range.
Would the other two witnesses agree with that assessment? I'm seeing some nodding. Madame Campana, okay, thank you. And okay, so that's news. Is there any reason in particular that you think we don't hear more about that? Why is that not more common knowledge or portrayed in media?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think primarily it's because women do tend to take on sort of a lot of the non-kinetic roles. So the things like attacks tend to be perpetrated more by men, although that is not exclusively the case. We see plenty of examples in many different contexts. So their roles with things like financiers or in logistical roles tend to not get the splashy media coverage. I also think that there's still some bias in media reporting and perhaps in law enforcement and security services to see women as a threat.
Okay. And is there do you see a socioeconomic sort of influence in background, perhaps in childhood or otherwise? Is there anything demographically in the background of folks that are drawn to extremism or pulled in, or whatever word we'd like to use? Is there any commonalities that you're seeing? Ms. Davis, you can go ahead, and if others have something, they can.
Sounds good. So I would say that in all sort of terrorism and extremism, there's a wide variety of demographic backgrounds, large variation in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds. In the IMVE space, I think that it is correct to sort of point a little bit of this towards younger men, but that's not exclusive. And I don't think that it's a good place from which to sort of make policy or to direct investigation. So we really need to be open to the wide variety of backgrounds that we see in this space.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're seeing quite a bit of extremism. I mean, I think you made the point, Ms. Davis, that this, or no, sorry, I think it was Mr. Sheikh that had made the point that this extremism in this form has been around for quite some time, but we're really, I think perhaps it's the advent of social media, we're becoming much more aware of it. Would you say that that's accurate, Mr. Sheikh?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. Certainly, as I mentioned in my comments, that social media has become a force multiplier for these extremist groups. I can remember back in the mid 90s when the war in Chechnya had kicked off and the first real Wahhabist Salafi jihadist manifestations were present there. Beheading videos were available on CDs. And then in the early 2000s, those video clips were uploaded onto the just emerging social media and internet, really. And then it became password protected chat forums, and then it just became open public forums. So certainly social media has given things a very different spin. And just very quickly on the last question on commonalities and backgrounds, really the two most common things are ideology and grievances. Ideology without grievances doesn't resonate, and grievances without ideology are not acted upon. And those two do tend to be common elements when we talk about this space. Thank you.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Just on the ideology and grievances?
Yeah, that last piece that you said.
Yeah, so the quote, and I'm taking the quote from Peter Neumann, who was the former director for the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. So the quote goes, ideology without grievances doesn't resonate, doesn't appeal to the mind, doesn't make sense. And grievances without ideology are not acted upon, because here ideology are action enabling ideas. And one can look at both of those kind of somewhat equally or at least not favoring one over the other. For example, there's a limit to ideology sometimes. For example, when we hear about jihadist groups in the Middle East, for example, if the US was to suddenly pack up and leave, I don't believe that, especially for those who believe that US military occupation is a grievance in this regard. If the US military was to leave, the jihadists are not going to suddenly start playing nice with everybody. So there's a limit to the grievances. And when it comes to the ideology, again, sometimes ideology is a driver of violent extremism. But at other times, it's just a passenger with other psychosocial factors at the wheel. So it's important for us to look at the multiplicity of factors and not just try to do that one-size-fits-all attribution.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And we're seeing in Canada, I think it was mentioned, I'm not sure which witness did, but that there are sometimes lone actors that are driven perhaps by the influence of social media. Then you mentioned jihadis in the Middle East.
10 seconds, please.
Are those lone actors as well? Like, would you distinguish those as lone actors in the Middle East, or is that more of a, I'm not even sure how to describe it.
Answer, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, the whole point on lone actors is somewhat tricky because, even the lone wolf is born in a den. So you can have inspired actors, but then you can also have people who are directed attackers, where an organization specifically funds and directs an individual to commit attacks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now move to Mr. Chang, who has 6 minutes in this round. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all the witnesses participating today for giving your time to this valuable committee that we have here. My question is directed to Mr. Sheikh. It is clear from your opening statement that you have a very high level of experience combating extremism in Canada. From your perspective, how have the threats of extremism in Canada changed and evolved over the years that you have been working in this field?
Sure. Thank you, sir. The main change is really social media that has really amplified the messaging of threat actors, as well as given them the opportunity to recruit out in the open in many cases. I understand there's a whole other topic on what to do with big tech, quote unquote, and holding them responsible, really, when it comes to allowing them to use their platforms in the way that they've been used. So I would say really the media space is the biggest change. But also I would say that because of COVID, of course, and unforeseen circumstances such as COVID, it's really thrown us into a situation where we almost don't know where the threat is going to come from tomorrow. Also, you have individuals who are basically picking and choosing from the salad bar of extremist ideologies. Some of them may be far right, but they may also have anti-vaxxer views. All far right members have anti-Semitic views. You have Islamophobic views. So very often you have people who are just picking and choosing, and ultimately, are just upset at whatever's happening in the world, or just frustrated. Of course, COVID just exacerbated and made that even worse. And so these are some of the things that have made things different for us today than yesterday.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. Thank you for your answer. Our time is very, very valuable and short here, so I'm going to share my time with Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. And thanks to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Sheikh, good to see you again, as always. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on one of the things you talked about in your opening statement? And it would really be this. In your view, having seen the space of ideologically motivated violent extremism as you have, what would you say is the number one threat or group or set of groups that Canadians should be concerned about when we think about IMV in today's context?
Sure. In Canada, we have a number of groups that pose a risk to us, and I don't mean the groups that were designated on the terrorist watch list. Proud Boys, for example. Proud Boys Canada, for example, we're not really involved in violent acts, but it's the other groups that we may not be aware of as well as we should be. For example, some years ago, I think it was Vice News did a piece on this anti-Muslim militia out in Alberta. They were openly posing with firearms. They made very clear their statements of hating Muslims and ready to take up arms against what they saw as the invasion of Muslims in Canada. There was a lot of questions at the time of why aren't these people being arrested, and I'm pretty sure that there are active investigations ongoing in that regard. But these are the kinds of groups that worry me and are real threats to public safety. More recently, we saw the emergence of a group called, supposedly a group, it started out as a joke, Diagolon, Diagolon, and it was made up of former members of the Canadian Forces, individuals with real combat training, with real capabilities, and who have grown increasingly radicalized, especially because of COVID. And these are people with weapons. I mean, there is an alleged connection between this group and the group that was arrested at the Coutts border crossing, ready to engage police in a firefight, in a shootout. So these are the kinds of groups that I consider to be a real and significant threat to Canadian public safety at large.
Thank you, Mr. Sheikh. Madame Campagna, la même question pour vous.
The same question for you, Ms. Campagna. In your opinion, which groups should concern us the most? Well, I share my colleague's opinion entirely on this matter. The most visible groups aren't necessarily the most worrisome ones. They are the underground groups or semi-underground groups, clandestine groups that use imported rhetoric mainly from the United States and draw their inspiration from it. I can't necessarily name them because as a researcher, I haven't come across them or their ethical considerations. But for example, we see them present in social media, getting organized and recruiting throughout a number of provinces.
With the last 30 seconds, Ms. Davis, I guess you talked about the influencers and the fact that people are now profiting off hate and profiting off creating this type of ideologically motivated, pretty awful stuff. How do we stop it? How do we stop that funding?
10 seconds, please.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and one that I think needs a public-private partnership, talking to the tech companies, talking to the financial service companies, and also maybe rethinking how we think about extremism in this country.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Ms. Larouche. Ms. Larouche, welcome to our committee. You're very welcome to be a part of this discussion, and the floor is now yours for the next 6 minutes. Take it away.
Merci. Donc,
Thank you very much. It's with great interest that I listened to the witnesses this morning in this first round. This is an extremely important issue, ideologically motivated violent extremism. Ms. Campagne, my first question, please. After your research on online messages of Quebec movements, conspirationalists, we have learned more about this movement. What can you tell us about that particular group and other similar groups that have reared their ugly heads since the beginning of the pandemic? And we hope that as we come out of this public health crisis, do you believe that most of those groups will disband or even meet their demise? What do you expect with a reduced case count as we come out of the pandemic? Well, I don't think that they will disappear. Perhaps they will change tack or join other groups. Some individuals, some groups have stood up against public health measures. They've become international specialists, quote unquote, and are trying to justify the war between Ukraine and Russia. You talked about at the beginning of the pandemic there being some degree of unity between these groups. But at first blush, there is no real unity, only a convergence of ideas and notions. What is COVID? Is it really a deadly disease, as the governments are trying to tell us? Are these public health measures really helpful? What will be the upshot of them? A lot of conspiracy theories have been perpetrated and circulated. Some of them are just so far-fetched and ridiculous. But it's very hard to find some underlying unifying factors among all of these groups. Follow-up question. In your research, you looked at the socio-family and individual factors that led to the development of these extremist groups. What are the root causes of the emergence of these ideologically motivated violent extremist groups in Canada in particular, and what has your research taught you? Response: it's not an easy answer. There's not one single answer. As my colleagues alluded to earlier, there's a variety of socioeconomic profiles, especially on the far right. I've focused on jihad movements, and it's true most of them are young men. There are some women, but they're mostly in the background. They look after logistics, communications, support. On the far right, the profiles are a tad different. We have older men, women who are getting more and more visibly involved, even though they're on the fringes. Now, why do they get engaged in these groups? Perhaps it's their education handed down from their parents. Perhaps their parents held very anti-system points of view, racist points of view that pushed their children to have the same views, or teenagers who are trying to put a distance between themselves and the dominant opinions in society that join these fringe groups. And little by little, they will start to espouse extremist points of view. And that is a gateway to violence, isn't it? Internet is breaking up. And some draw their inspiration from certain ideologies that are being bandied about in echo chambers. And they're responsible. The buck does stop with these social media platforms because this is allowing these kinds of beliefs to take root and get amplified in these echo chambers. It's very interesting to hear what you have to say. When I came to this committee before, we focused on this, and when it comes from a feminist standpoint, you just referred to the role of women in these movements, and you talked about four characteristics: white supremacy, nativism. Could you please elaborate on the role of women and elaborate on the four characteristics that you briefly alluded to in your opening remarks? Response: absolutely. When we did our research out on the ground, we held about 50 interviews with people who have taken part in these far-right groups and activities. And what we noted was that there was a presence of women, but they systematically refused to speak to us because they were afraid of being recognized. But they are well and truly there, sometimes in the background, supporting their husband, their brother, their father, who are activists and militants in these groups. And they also play the role of ideologue in some of these groups. They're not in the foreground, but they're still well and truly there. In 2013, at the start of our research and right through to today, we're seeing that women are increasingly visible in the public space, and they seem to be a bit more moderate in their rhetoric, but in fact they are the actors who are there to propagate certain messaging, including white supremacy, i.e. a preference given to men and women with white skin. Nativism, for example, means sort of buying into certain rhetoric. And I forgot the two other characteristics from my list. I'm sorry, just let me refer back to it. Sorry about that. I just have a tickle in my throat. Now, as far as conspiracy theories are concerned, there are a whole host of them that are circulating. QAnon ideology, quote unquote, has well and truly penetrated far-right groups over the past 2 to 3 years. Question. So, in your opinion, those are the 4 characteristics that determine where these groups hide out in social media, and you raise the issue of weaponization and financing, and it goes much further than those 4 characteristics. Response. Yes, those characteristics are highly malleable, they overlap, and social media indeed uses these characteristics to recruit and finance.
The last slot of the opening round is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sheikh, maybe I'd like to start with you, just continuing on the remarks that you've made about grievances amongst individuals and some of these groups. In your opening statement, you did say in the final paragraph that no amount of government legislation or criminal designation is going to suffice. In your view, if we are going to effectively tackle these grievances, what kind of recommendations would you like to see this committee make to the federal government that is outside the area of legislation or criminal designation? Like, in what ways can the federal government effectively partner to tackle those grievances?
Thank you, sir. I think the Canadian government has been doing a relatively good job in this on this front, especially with the Canada Centre, through which a lot of engagement with communities and social service organizations is being done. We in Canada actually avoided a major pitfall of some other projects along these lines in other countries where they were top-down, government-driven, prescriptive approaches to countering extremism and to dealing with these grievances. We instead went with a more collaborative approach. The Canadian government understood who the social service organizations were, or activist groups included, who were doing the work on the ground with at-risk communities. And it really generated organically an ability for these participants, whether in pre-existing social service agencies and organizations, as well as call them community groups or activist groups, to actually begin to work together and offload some of the challenges when it came to young people, very young people, like children, young teenagers, even adults, to be able to kind of deal with those grievances on a one-on-one basis. So really, the recommendation I would just give is keep doing that for the federal government or the government in general, just to keep working together with organizations that are already there on the ground doing this work and who have been doing this work for some time. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to get on the bike and ride.
Thank you. You mentioned that your organization, Parents for Peace, is right now testifying before the United States Congress on the subject of radicalization with, I think, the United States Armed Forces. We've had examples, of course, here in Canada, not only with our military, but with our police. It's been revealed that some members of various Canadian police forces were donating to the illegal occupation of Ottawa despite their role in society to serve and protect the communities in which they live. In your view, how concerned should we be about radicalization in our military currently and in our police forces? And in your view, what effective measures can we take to counter that radicalization?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking that. And I actually do have my phone here on the side watching the House committee testimony happen at the same time. It is definitely a concern. It is a real concern, especially when it comes to military members who have specialist information and capabilities, because of PTSD or other issues that develop as a result of their service, could, for those, for the very small number that could go on to become violent actors, they could be very effective at what they're doing. In fact, you will see as well, and again, I don't want to say that I don't believe it is as pervasive a threat in the military. You can see from the individuals that we've been seeing kind of speaking up from the military, very few of them actually come from the regular forces. Most of them have come from the reserve forces. I don't know if there's a cultural issue with that, but again, I want to say that it is a real threat. And in terms of what we can do about it, I think there needs to be, internal discipline mechanisms for the Canadian Forces to use, but also for police services to be using. I've been kind of watching, reading different articles that have been coming out in the media of police officers who, were making video statements in support of the so-called convoy, and have rightfully been reprimanded professionally because of their participation. And so I think we should strengthen the ability of police managers and supervisors and military managers and supervisors to implement a disciplinary system in which they can hold individuals accountable.
And very quickly to Ms. Davis, you've talked about some of the gaps that we have in countering the financial aspect of this. I'd like to hear your views on, with social media algorithms and how social media companies can sometimes monetize the hate on their platforms through advertising, because they know that extremist content drives up viewership, which allows advertisers to reach more audiences. Do you have any thoughts on the monetization of hate on social media platforms?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So it's not just the propagandists who are profiting from this, it's really the companies themselves. So we need to create some disincentives for them to not be able to make the kind of money that they're making from hateful content, from extremist content. It's not a simple solution, but I think that this is where the conversation needs to go.
Thank you very much. We owe you 5 seconds, Mr. McGregor. Let's move now to the second round of questioning. We'll start with Mr. Lloyd, who has 5 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for coming today. Seeing a definite theme in the testimony, we're seeing extremism on the rise in terms of, and this is not an exhaustive list, but anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, certainly some anti-establishment rhetoric. But what I haven't heard about is 2 cases that are also concerning to me. A rise in environmental extremism. One case in point is the recent attack at the Coastal GasLink site, where extensive damage was done to property and traumatizing workers on that site. And also in my own community, one of many communities last summer that endured attacks against places of worship, including the iconic Saint Jean Baptiste Church in Morinville that was burned to the ground shortly after Canada Day. Just wondering if you could comment, maybe Ms. Davis, on these extremist trends, and what are you seeing in relation to these as well?
Yeah, I think that the Coastal GasLink example in particular is troubling, mostly because it did rise to quite a bit of property destruction and potentially some injuries to individuals involved. I think one of the issues that we face in Canada writ large across the sort of terrorism and extremist landscape is a lack of application of our laws evenly across the ideological spectrum. And this in the IMVE space has led to a certain sense of impunity for some of those actors. So in terms of resolution to this issue, I think that we do need to encourage resources and investigative resources, particularly, to be applying our laws across that political spectrum.
Thank you. Actually, you raised a really important point, sense of impunity. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that because, in a lot of these, particularly, in the Coastal GasLink example and with the church burning example, a lot of the suspects or the perpetrators still haven't been caught or tried. I did do some research, and there have been a couple of perpetrators who have been placed on house arrest, and their charges and trials are still ongoing. But I wonder if you can elaborate on this sense of impunity idea you raised.
I think this, to a certain extent, relates to Mr. McGregor's question about the police officers, particularly, who were donating to the convoy. I think in the IMVE space, there's been a real sense that a lot of these actors can get away with it, in particular because there is, to a certain extent, some radicalization in police and the military. So it creates a sense that they're not going to face any consequences. And I think this is true for those police officers who donated to the convoy. And I think it might be true across in some other aspects of political violence in Canada. We've been very focused on the jihadist threat for a very long time. I think we're starting to see some broadening out amongst our law enforcement and security services to address other types of threats, but I'm not sure that we're where we need to be yet.
I appreciate that. Something that really struck me about your testimony and Mr. Sheikh's testimony is we seem, we're not there yet, but we seem as a country to become very adept at disrupting organized groups. And I think that's why we're seeing more of these sort of lone wolf attacks. And I'm not sure if, like in the church burning cases, that this was an organized thing. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that. But maybe you could comment on, when we're seeing these lone wolf attacks, these people aren't just coming out of nowhere. They're being sort of developed in an environment. And I'm wondering, if you could comment on the environmental aspects of, not in terms of the environment, but in terms of the political environment that they're rising out of. Thank you.
Yeah, this relates very much to the way I see the IMVE threat in Canada and globally. I don't see it as really focused on groups. I see it much more as loose movements, a set of ideologies. And I think this actually applies to both maybe IMVE, across that political spectrum for IMVE actors, so depending on whatever it is they're attacking. So we tend to not see those organizational structures. This impacts our ability to investigate those actors. I prefer the term lone actor because lone wolf tends to glorify a little bit the actors themselves. But without that structure, it does make it more difficult to combat the threat. Not impossible. There's been really important work done by particularly my former organization, CSIS, on indicators of mobilization to violence, but it is an ongoing challenge.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move to Ms. Demoff, who will have a 5-minute block. The floor is yours, Ms. Demoff.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Mr. Sheikh. You mentioned the Canada Centre and the good work that they were doing. I know they do the good work that they do on a shoestring budget, and I'm just wondering if you think the federal government should be providing more funding to it.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. That was the response I thought I would get. My second question is for Ms. Campana. You mentioned algorithms in your opening remarks, and we hear a lot about from the social media companies about the proprietary nature of algorithms. And I wonder if you believe that the federal government should have additional regulations so that social media companies are more accountable and transparent when it comes to algorithms.
Certainement.
Absolutely. Well, we have here an issue that is led to the emergence of echo chambers, i.e., digital platforms are, generally speaking, regardless of their particular nature, help to identify individuals with particular beliefs, ideologies, and causes. How is that? Well, because they don't just propagate rhetoric, they selection individuals. They craft their ideas, they hone in on them by the way of algorithms that like to say that they know our preferences. When you shop for shoes online, when you open your browser a couple of hours or a couple of days later, well, Google will have a lot of pop-ups with other shoes on your screen appear. The same is true of these ideological motivated violent extremist groups. If you visit Facebook, Twitter, you will be faced with these kind of ideologies that crystallize these beliefs. And social media helps to propagate rumors, which are sometimes based on conspiracy theories, but not always. And those rumors will be particularly attractive for folks who are asking themselves questions, sometimes legitimate, about strategies to fight COVID-19, for example. And as they are exposed to conspiracy theories more and more with these underpinned by simplistic ideas, well, they become inspired by those groups, those individuals that are propagating these extremist ideologies online.
So, sorry, so I appreciate the explanation. So do you feel that we should be bringing in further regulations on this then?
Absolutely, yes, I do.
And Ms. Davis, thank you so much for being here today. CSIS public report in 2020 talked about how the pandemic had exacerbated xenophobic and anti-authority narratives, many directly and indirectly impacting national security. I'm wondering if you have seen the pandemic influencing how IMVE is funded.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think that the broader trend of the pandemic pushing people more online has very likely increased the funding of those influencers because, they're spending more time online. People are spending more time donating money to different causes, across the different political spectrum and for different ideas. So I think that that's part of what's been happening and why we've seen so many influencers achieve such incredible amounts of wealth. But for the actual attacks by IMVE actors, a lot of that's the same. So they're still doing a lot of self-financing, low-level, low-cost attacks. And this is very likely in part because our counter-terrorist financing policies have been somewhat effective at driving actors to those types of low-cost attacks.
I only have a minute left, Ms. Davis. What changes should the government make when it comes to funding, whether it be crowdfunding or other issues? What kind of changes should we be making to restrict funding for IMVE?
This gets into a tricky situation in terms of freedom of expression and people's allowing people to sort of say what they will online. But I think that we might be on firmer ground if we look to restrict the ability of individuals to raise funds from hateful content, ensuring that financial technology companies, social media platforms enforce their own terms of service. And that they don't let people create these giant platforms where they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars by basically spreading hate.
We have to do a little bit of surgical snipping. In the next four, they will be surgical and only snips, which means that Ms. LaRouche, you have 2 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Ms. Campagne, for this last round, I don't have much time, but after the attacks in 2019 in New Zealand, there was a building awareness about the hold that the far right has, and this has become increasingly apparent, and transnationalization of these ideologies is rampant across the world because it's based on conspiracy theories and neo-Nazi imagery, which has become very popular with the far right. 3 years later, do you believe that the circulating of these ideas has accelerated and is even more broadly broadcast than it previously was? Response: well, yes, indeed, I do believe that these ideas are circulating faster and faster. There are other ideas that have been latched onto them to do with the public health crisis that we're experiencing currently. How do we address this? Just like my colleague said, Jessica Davies, we address this by regulating social media, and we also need to ask ourselves the following question. How is this rhetoric penetrating outside far-right echo chambers and other extremist groups? Question: Well, there are some social media organizations that have tougher and tougher rules and regulations against hate speech, for example. What else needs to be done? Yes, that is one way, but I haven't thought about the concrete mechanisms to stem this tide, but we do need to make progress in this to contain the spread of this kind of ideology. Thank you very much.
Mr. McGregor, you have 2 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair. To Professor Campana, in your view, how much of a threat do misinformation and disinformation present to our democracy?
Well, that's a highly complicated question. There are communication spaces, quote unquote, that are developing in a parallel fashion. For example, the dominant media, conventional media, and the alternative media, on the other hand, which is being, in fact, fed by far-right groups and ideologically driven groups who are propagating conspiracy theories. And there are other groups, there are countries, for example, Russia, that is also having a bearing brought to bear on these communication spaces. And as I said in my opening remarks, our society in Canada isn't as polarized as the US is, but there is this kind of ideology is in fact feeding into division, and that's what we need to avoid.
For my final minute, you have recommended that we do regulate social media platforms, but specifically following on the question I asked Ms. Davis on how social media is able to monetize hate through getting multiple viewers and really getting that advertising video or that advertising revenue. Do you have any specific recommendations on that aspect, on how we regulate the ability to monetize hate on social media platforms?
Well, once again, I haven't thought about concrete mechanisms. I'm a researcher at the end of the day. So, but what we have noted is that some individuals do emerge as influencers. And they use that position to fund themselves and to finance other movements. And those individuals are able to circulate from one platform to another, and they warrant our particular attention.
2 more short interventions. First, Mr. Van Popta, you have 3 minutes, sir. The floor is yours.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question will be for Mr. Sheikh. Thank you for being here, sir. In your opening address, you talked about the role of community in preventing trajectories of violent extremism. And you highlighted that people with these extreme views should be felt to be unwelcome and their views unsustainable and impractical in what you call a cosmopolitan future life here that we live here in Canada. But yet we see some young people having been born and raised here in Canada with Western values becoming radicalized and traveling overseas to join terrorist groups. What do you say about that? What's the solution there?
Thank you, sir, for your question. My comment was really on how we can treat the proliferation of these views in a public context. So for teachers to deal with, trying to prevent a student from becoming radicalized. Very recently, actually, I think it was funded by or supported by the Ministry of Public Safety, where, there were some instructions or, a training for teachers basically to identify students who might be becoming radicalized and how to deal with that. And there was a whole discourse on, teachers should just be teachers. I mean, teachers are not spies. Teachers are not police. Of course, there are, duties to report where a teacher, comes across information that is of a serious nature that just like doctors and other professionals have a duty to report. In this case, they would have to do the same thing. But the message that I gave to the teachers was that, a student is greatly influenced by their teachers, depending on especially what period of development they're in as children, or whether they're teenagers or so on. And they can bring to bear their expertise as teachers or as pastors or whatever it is, whatever their particular context is in which they engage with these individuals. So my statement about basically making people understand that these supremacist, absolutist views that people take are unsustainable and impractical for life in Canada. As for those people who have grown up in the West and went over there, we, at the end of the day, we will not be able to prevent all radicalization. A certain amount of people will just go down that radicalization rabbit hole. And unfortunately, at some point, it's past the prevention stage and will now fall into the intervention stage. And that's really where the authorities will have to bring to bear their capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's my time.
For the last round, Mr. Noor Mohammed, you have 3 minutes, sir. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. To Mr. Sheikh, one of the themes through all of this is what I would sort of term the issue of prevention and sort of how you understand where you are today. There is a politicization and an influence of politicization in terms of how we think about these issues. Can you share with us your thoughts or your concerns about the ways in which some of these things have become political, both here and in the United States, and some of the things that we might want, as elected officials, we might want to be aware of in the way we speak about these things to ensure that we are not helping to fan the flames?
A very good question. Thank you for that. I used to joke sometimes whenever I gave a presentation on radicalization, I used to say that, radicalization is not a condition that only affects brown people. For a long time, the discourse around radicalization was centered on the Muslim community, obviously because of the post 9/11 environment, and then also accelerated with this ISIS crisis that we went through. But as researchers know very well, radicalization is a condition that affects anybody if the conditions are right, if the ingredients are there. It's like I like to make a lot of jokes sometimes with the cupcake theory of radicalization, is that if the ingredients are there, the temperature is right, you're going to get cupcakes, right? And so one thing we need to understand is that this is a human process. This is something that any human being can go through, any group, any nationality, political or otherwise, if the ingredients are there. So the number one is to understand that this is a human psychological process that anybody can go through it. Number two, I would say, is that we need to be equal in the way in which we prosecute individuals. As my fellow panelist was talking about, Jessica Davis was talking about applying the laws equally across the board. We have terrorism laws. Why are we only applying them to brown people? We have individuals, who are not brown. Sorry to be simplistic like that, but individuals who are, really engaging in serious offenses, and they should be investigated and prosecuted accordingly. Sometimes, however, you get cases, and these are legal issues that obviously I'm not qualified to speak on, but you might have a terrorist incident, but there might not be a terrorist charge. For example, the London family attack, there was a terrorist charge in that. The individual murdered several members of the family during Ramadan of last year, and Ramadan is about to start in a few more days just now. But you have other cases where, for example, the Bissonnette mass murder at the Quebec Mosque, there were no terrorism charges. Of course, there were first-degree murder charges, which are easier to prove and carry a life sentence. So
10
this
seconds,
just kind of
please.
shows you. This just kind of shows you that we should be more equal in the way in which we apply these laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of all members of the committee, I want to thank the witnesses for some very compelling testimony on some deeply disturbing issues. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us this morning. Colleagues, we now take a 5-minute break to suspend the meeting for a change in panelists. See you in 5. To order. Thank you very much, everybody, witnesses, members. I just want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. There will be 5 minutes of introductory remarks from our witnesses. They are Martin Jeffrey from the Centre d'expertise et de formation sur les antagonismes religieux, les idéologies.
Center of Expertise on Training in Religious Fundamentalism, Politically Driven Ideology and Radicalization.
Prevention of radicalization leading to violence, and Mr. Daniel Rogers from the Global Disinformation Index. Maybe I would ask Mr. Rogers to begin. If you wouldn't mind, sir, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the funding mechanisms of ideologically motivated violent extremist groups. I am the co-founder and the executive director of the Global Disinformation Index, a nonprofit focused on catalyzing change in the technology industry to disrupt the business model of online disinformation. In 2020, my colleague Ben Decker and our team at the GDI collaborated with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue to conduct a series of studies entitled Bankrolling Bigotry that examined the funding mechanisms of a selection of hate groups in North America and Europe. Many of these groups are the same ones associated with recent acts of ideologically motivated violent extremism in recent years. I appear before you today to discuss what we learned about how the technology and payments companies enable groups like those that participated in these events to operate. These groups leverage the internet as a primary means of disseminating their toxic ideologies and soliciting funds. One only needs to search Amazon or Etsy or Teespring or Redbubble to uncover shirts, hats, mugs, books, and other paraphernalia that both monetize and further popularize the ideologically motivated violent extremist threat. Last year, at least 24 individuals indicted for their role in the January 6th insurrection in the United States, including 8 members of the Proud Boys, a group the Canadian government has designated as a terrorist entity, used crowdfunding site GiveSendGo to raise nearly $250,000 in donations. And it's not just about the money. Merchandise like t-shirts that I just mentioned, they act as team jerseys to help these groups recruit new members and foment further hatred towards their targets. In North America, we analyzed the digital footprints of 73 groups across 60 websites and 225 social media accounts, and their use of 54 different online fundraising mechanisms, including 47 payment platforms, 5 different cryptocurrencies, and we ultimately found 191 instances of hate groups using online fundraising services to support their activities. The funding mechanisms included both primary platforms like Amazon, intermediary platforms such as Stripe or Shopify, crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe, payment facilitators like PayPal, monetized content streaming services like YouTube, Super Chats, and cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. All of these payment mechanisms were linked to websites or social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Telegram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Gab, BitChute, and others. The sheer number of companies I just mentioned is the first clue to the scale and the scope of the problem. This is not an issue of any one individual company, but rather a systemic problem of hate and bigotry exploiting an entire industry and even sometimes government policy to raise funds, peddle extremist ideologies, and commit acts of violence. We did a similar analysis of hate groups in Europe with a specific focus on Germany ahead of their recent federal elections and found similar results. A number of our conclusions stood out in performing this work. For starters, over half of the platforms we identified already had policies to explicitly prohibit hate and extremism, but those policies simply went unenforced. In the United States, we found a large fraction of the groups we studied had approved tax-exempt status. In fact, a full 100% of anti-Muslim groups, 75% of anti-immigrant groups, 70% of anti-LGBTQ groups, and a third of the militias that we identified, including the Oath Keepers, had US 501c3 or 501c4 tax-exempt status, giving them access to a whole spectrum of charity fundraising tools from Facebook donations to Amazon Smile, to the point that the most common fundraising platform we identified across all of our data was actually Charity Navigator's Giving Basket function. Simply put, private industry must step up and do more. Since the publication of our first report last October, we've documented at least 17 actions taken by platforms against the North American groups we enumerated. For example, 4 of the 6 payment mechanisms routing funds to the Oath Keepers have been blocked. Amazon has even removed them from Amazon Smile. But 17 actions out of the nearly 200 instances we observed speaks to the rampant way the problem has been allowed to persist. In fact, after most platforms removed the Oath Keepers, payment facilitator RallyPay continued to service the group's fundraising needs, even as the group's leader was indicted in the United States for seditious conspiracy. More must be done, industry-wide standards must be set, and enforcement across both public and private sectors must be stepped up. Platforms must be held to measurable commitments and transparency regimens and subjected to third-party scrutiny to keep them accountable. So members of the committee, I thank you for your time today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Now I'll turn to Mr. Gosselin and invite you to give us a 5-minute opening statement. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. It's a pleasure to be with you and members of the committee today as we think about the rise and development of ideologically motivated violent extremism. Over the past 2 years, these forms of extremism have been strongly influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic and have crystallized around issues related to that pandemic, particularly within movements opposed to health measures, some of which are driven by conspiracy theories. Whilst the lion's share of opponents to public health measures remain non-violent, and other witnesses have alluded to this, and operate from with a framework of democratic rules, some groups and individuals have made threats and promoted violence against government officials, journalists, scientists, and health professionals. Anti-health measure movements are highly heterogeneous and decentralised, comprising many small groups with a wide range of ideologies that are united in their opposition to health measures and a populist framework of quote-unquote oppressed people standing up against the quote-unquote corrupt elites. And there are ideas circulating worldwide that are picked up on. For example, the US influence on the far-right movement in Quebec and in Canada. And the opposite is also true. The so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa testified to the fact that this had ripple effects across the world and became a breeding ground for similar actions worldwide. This attests to the fact that ideas circulate extremely quickly. The decentralised nature of the movements that led to the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa and several Canadian cities makes it extremely difficult to trace the networks of influence and organisation. Crowdfunding, in addition to the sale of merchandise, is this kind of movement's go-to source of funding, which monetizes individual memberships and engages forcefully in online mobilization. So among the main vectors of vulnerability, there's social isolation, anxiety, to do with the unknown, the pandemic, which leaves people vulnerable and open to simplistic ideas, extreme ideas, and preconceived notions. There's the polarization of public discourse that not only affects elected officials, but the media outlets and all political actors. So what I mean by this is there's a politicization of the public health crisis, the upshot of which was great uncertainty, a lot of unknowns among the Canadian public, which, as its result, in fact, sped up this radicalization in light of the polarized political debate and discourse. So what are the solutions that we have at our Centre for the Prevention of Radicalisation Leading to Violence? We are located in Montreal. We use education, mobilisation, support and awareness building to do our work. We reach out to those individuals and groups who are susceptible to radicalisation, and we promote a preventative approach. To date, and since the start of the pandemic, the lion's share of anti-health measure activists have remained non-violent. And among acts of violence, there's been most particularly online threats, which of course are very serious and need to be treated as such, but there's a lot of room for prevention, given the feeling of marginalisation, insecurity and anxiety that is at play here. So I'd invite you to reflect on those issues. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I would now invite Mr. Jeffrey to give us 5 minutes. No? He's not here. Well, believe me, we will not have any difficulty filling up the vacuum. Let's go right to a round of questions. We're going to get through the full first round, and then we'll see how much is left over. We'll start with Mr. Shipley. Sir, you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. And just as we're going on the fly a little bit, I did have a full list of questions for Mr. Jeffrey. So if I do run a little short, maybe one of my colleagues will fill me in just on the last couple of minutes just to start off with that. So I would like to start off, though, with Mr. Gosselin. I hope I'm saying his name properly. Mr. Gosselin, your community-led organization, as you said, seeks to prevent radical violence and hateful behaviors by mobilizing members and resources of the community. Could you please tell us about some of your success stories you've had?
Merci, Monsieur.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shipley, for your question. In most cases, well, the matters are confidential, so can't be raised in the public sphere. But the success stories are difficult to pin down in the sense that, well, had we not had a program at all, it would be a real problem. But the fact is that we got testimony from former sympathizers to the jihad movement that wanted to go to Syria, that have been supported and taken by the centre, and they, with our help, have managed to become reintegrated in society. And we have published their testimony in various publications anonymously. And there's also a comic book which has been used as an interesting tool as well to combat this radicalization. And there was also a Nazi sympathizer who we've helped to get beyond these hateful notions. And we work on a case-by-case basis. We do hear a lot of testimony of this ilk. We do need a more robust evaluation process Canada-wide to get a better idea of what initiatives do work best and what others don't.
And thank you for that. And thank you for the good work you're doing in that area. Knowing that you are a hands-on group, Mr. Gosselin, could you tell me a little bit about what your research and what you're seeing about what is really some of the background research into the social, familial, and individual factors that are associated with the emergence of these extremist groups in Canada? Or more simply put, what is the root cause?
C'est très difficile.
Well, it's really difficult to identify one single root cause. In a study on counterterrorism, for example, we focused on marginalized and underprivileged groups as being one factor. One of the main factors of radicalization is the sense, the feeling of being marginalized, which may be real or only perceived. At the time, with the jihad movements, there are a lot of second-generation youth born in Canada who realized as they became adults as practicing Muslims that they faced a lot of hate, and that contributed largely to pushing them into radicalization. The same is true with far-right groups. There's this sentiment, this feeling that immigration is somehow going to take something away from them, make them lose something that belongs to them, and yet this isn't corroborated through the research. But there's this feeling of being marginalized, which is the important thing here, along with other factors of vulnerability, family ties. It's clear from the evidence that those who have strong family ties are less susceptible to be radicalized, less susceptible to be violent, and less susceptible to be polarized in societal debates. And they're the main factors that, in response to your question, that I'd cite.
Thank you for that, sir. Now I'd like to jump to Dr. Rogers, if I could, just for a couple of quick questions. Mr. Rogers, how do you determine something to be disinformation?
Thank you for the question. That's a great question. We spent a lot of time at the GDI thinking through how we define the problem. I think so many of the sort of mainstream or common definitions of disinformation kind of lie in a sort of false dichotomy around, true or false. And people say disinformation is intentionally lying on the internet. But I always say, that sort of simplistic definition doesn't pass what I like to call the Santa Claus test, meaning, if it was really just about someone intentionally lying on the internet, we would be clamoring to deplatform every mention of Santa Claus, and we're clearly not doing that. So we look at disinformation through the lens of what we call adversarial narrative conflict. So anytime somebody's peddling a sort of intentionally misleading narrative, either implicitly or explicitly, often using combinations of cherry-picked elements of the truth combined with falsehoods, right? So, quoting someone who said something and saying, well, I that was just quoting them accurately without presenting a fuller picture, right, is an example of cherry-picking an element of the truth to craft a potentially misleading narrative. So anytime someone's intentionally peddling one of those misleading narratives, that in our view is adversarial against an at-risk group or individual or institution like science or medicine or a democratically elected government, and then most importantly carries with it a risk of harm, that to us is disinformation. And so we tend to identify disinformation specifically by specific narrative rather than just a broad
Thank you.
definition. Thank you.
Now I'll move to Mr. Noor Mohammed. Sir, you have a 6-minute slot. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses. Mr. Rogers, while you were talking, there was so much that you said that actually was very troubling. The issue related to the ways in which you have 401c3 designations for charitable organizations that are clearly anti-Muslim, so on and so forth, and the fact that it is so easy for people to profit off the sale of hate-filled, items. I did a quick Google search while you were talking, and it was uncomfortably easy to buy things, buy symbols of hate, whether it's swastikas, whether it's T-shirts, supporting the KKK, so on and so forth. So what tools do we have available what tools should we have available to ensure that people are not profiting off the sale of these symbols which promote hate and then by extension help to sort of build this populist narrative around these symbols as being something special rather than what they are, which is truly hateful symbols?
Yes, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I feel like all of these sort of phenomenon are the results of these larger kind of issues with the modern tech business model, one of audience attention capture and monetization. So when you look at the sale of these goods, it's all about different strategies for monetizing audiences and capturing that audience attention using increasingly extremist content, because it tends to also drive higher engagement. And so to me, one of the most important interventions lies around platform liability. And unfortunately, probably all of the sites that you looked for this merchandise are American companies, unfortunately, and they are mainly sort of have this relatively ahistoric and blanket liability waiver in the United States around the things that are carried on those platforms. And so I think looking at kind of platform liability for the kinds of things that these platforms carry, even if they're not explicitly selling it themselves, to me is one of the most important aspects of this, where platforms have policies sometimes, but when those policies either go unenforced or they don't exist, they're just generally shielded from liability for that. And I think that's what really needs to change.
Moving forward, sort of following on that, seeing what happened in the United States, you mentioned January 6th. We've seen obviously, some very difficult or some very, very concerning trend lines in Canada around conspiracy theories, around misinformation that then leads to action. One of the things that I'm very curious about, and I know many of my colleagues may be, is what is the role of political leaders in ensuring that they are not helping to feed these movements? What is, in your view, the responsibility, or should be the responsibility, of elected officials in ensuring that they are not feeding these narratives, which then lead to pretty dangerous action?
It's a very interesting question, and I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, only because our organization tends to focus on the sort of business model side of things, the tech industry change that we advocate for. But as a general statement, I would say politicians like others in prominent places have an outsized voice, and thus an outsized kind of reach and presence on in our modern information environment. And I guess I would just suffice to say that with great power comes great responsibility, especially when there's an obvious kind of path from whatever's being said towards an expectation of or risk of harm.
So let's go back to the business model piece. So I'm a tech guy. I used to run marketplaces, so I know this model well. And we have always had in the companies that I've worked in an obligation or made a commitment in the past to make sure we weren't selling those types of products. How do we, as now elected officials, work with these platforms to make sure they understand the consequences, whether it's carrot, whether it's stick, combination, to ensure that there is this sense that you can't get away with letting this stuff happen and pretending it doesn't have a long-term consequence on the way in which people behave? What should we be doing? How should we be acting? And what are some of the triggers or what are some of the tools that we should be using to help, whether it's carrot or stick, in making that conversation something that platforms that are selling products need to be engaged in?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you. I think you said carrot and stick, and I think there's two elements that can really help industry tackle this better. One is better definitions. I think that's a place where industry has a lot of trouble, and I'll use the kind of in the U.S. There's a lot of these groups unfortunately have charity designations, and so now you're asking commercial companies to go against a kind of official government designation. So having better definitions and stronger enforcement around those definitions is one area that I think will really help industry. And the other area is really around, as I said, liability, right? Platforms currently enjoy this kind of blanket and ahistoric liability waiver, at least in the United States. And I think if that could change, that would be the stick side of things to actually enforce real product liability for these platforms, their algorithms, their marketplaces, et cetera, that they currently don't have.
Thank you very much. Give that time back to the chair. Thank you.
Take it. Thank you. Then we'll move right into Ms. Laroche. You have a full 6-minute slot. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our two witnesses. As part of the second panel today, my first question will be for Mr. Gosselin. And based on what my previous colleague said regarding the carrot and the stick notion, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We can sometimes perceive, sometimes it's difficult to in fact, determine who the individuals are concerned when groups are radicalized. So how does your centre use the carrot and the stick approach? And I'd also like to hear your thoughts on the difficulties around the assessment process of potentially radicalized individuals. And then we'll come back to the whole notion of carrot and stick. Response. Thank you very much. Indeed, how do we help people get out of extremism through a social approach? It's not easy. In fact, it's really difficult, and it's usually obviously on a voluntary basis. But it is most times possible. It's often when an individual has doubts or misgivings about their engagement, they call it into question, and there needs to be organizations to help them throughout that process. Now, you referred to the carrot and the stick. Well, we are there first and foremost to help these people. Sometimes their ideas that they spout and peddle are antisocial, they're violent, they're also based in ignorance. But why are they there? It's because some of their needs as human beings are fundamentally being unmet. Now, as far as the evaluation or assessment process is concerned, as there's the issue of confidentiality, of course, and how urgent these matters are, it's often difficult to have effective measurement tools in place. And that has been observed across the board when it comes to the prevention of radicalization writ large across the entire world. It's very difficult to demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt or possible doubt that X, Y, or Z led to an individual leaving a radicalized group. We have good, strong indicators that are suggestive, but we have limited resources, and most of the resources of these centres are focused on the programs and the implementation thereof themselves. So that is why we need more support. Question. Yes, there are a number of centres in Quebec that focus on this issue of radicalisation, aren't there? Now I'd like to hear you elaborate on the carrot and stick. This issue is raised both in the Status of Women Committee and in this committee, and that is the importance of legislating on online hate. And you slipped that into your opening remarks, didn't you? So mostly we use the stick to penalise those who spout hate speech. And then there's the whole issue of these online platforms that are funded successfully and ensure the survival of these radical groups. So what else could the federal government do, in your opinion, and in the opinion of your organisation? Response. Well, we're not really in a position to recommend any particular type of legislation or statute, but quite clearly, online hate speech is rampant and widespread and causing major ramifications. And we conducted a study on online speech and online hate speech, which demonstrated that in our based on our sample, that they're most serious and more damaging than that kind of hate speech in person. And that's counterintuitive, isn't it? But it shows that being verbally aggressive online needs to be criminalized and punished. Now, sometimes when people do act on these hateful ideas, it can affect entire communities. And there are people who feel like they no longer have a place in society, and that leads to their further radicalization. But I can't really recommend any specific legislation. What I can say is that this issue needs to be dealt with seriously by legislators. Indeed, 100%. You said that you focused on rehabilitation and prevention, but as you said, the testimony that you've heard speaks to how important online hate speech is, and that we do hope that we'll be able to determine cause and effect in our studies. But in my second round, I'd like to come back to the most important factors underpinning radicalization that were observed early in the pandemic. Perhaps we can elaborate on that in the second round. Well, yes, I can take a stab at that immediately.
On this round, we have to keep moving, and I will go directly to Mr. McGregor. Sir, you have a 6-minute slot. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses, and Mr. Rogers, your opening statement certainly gave us a lot to think about. Just about the platforms that have policies against hate but are not enforcing it. We as a committee have had Stripe, we've had GoFundMe, and we've had GiveSendGo appear as witnesses. And in fact, when GoFundMe was before our committee, in the opening statement that was made, they did state that fundraising campaigns relating to misinformation, hate speech, violence, and more are prohibited by their terms of service. But I pointed out to GoFundMe that there was a lot of misinformation associated with the convoy that came to Ottawa. It was quite evident that misinformation was surrounding the whole convoy as early as mid-January, leading up to the illegal occupation of Ottawa. But they did not stop the fundraising to the convoy until, I believe, February the 4th. Similarly, Stripe had an integral role with particularly Give, Send, Go, who took up the slack in fundraising for the illegal occupation after GoFundMe stopped it. And Give, Send, Go just simply didn't seem to really care about what they were fundraising. So I guess my question to you is, what is it about companies and why they are not self-policing? Is it just that there is just an obscene amount of money to be made? Is there any, are you getting any positive reaction from them, like when your organization points out what's going on their platforms? Can you illuminate a little bit more for us what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's sort of a monolithic answer. I mean, certainly financial considerations are part of it. Although I guess one of the lessons I've learned in the last few years of doing this work is that it's only a part of it, right? And if you think about, imagine the amount of money that GoFundMe was making off of that Convoy fundraiser itself is probably not very much. And so I would say it probably goes more deeply to the culture of the tech industry. Being relatively anti-regulation, relatively anti sort of pro-free speech, and there's just sort of a cultural headwind towards taking action. Our experience has just been that the response from different private companies really depends on the company and depends on the culture of that company. So some companies are adamantly opposed, some are very kind of proactive partners of ours who are eager to work more proactively in enforcing and implementing policies, and some fall in the middle. I think a lot of what you see is driven by public perception more than anything else. That the reason that GoFundMe probably didn't take action initially is because there wasn't a lot of public scrutiny and thus not a lot of attention being paid. And I think that is certainly a default position of most platforms, that unless there's public or sort of journalistic interest in a particular problematic event happening on their platform, then it tends to get ignored. And then I'll also say that where we've seen, as a more general rule, more proactivity is where there's healthier competition. And so the parts of the market, whether it's ad tech or other parts of the tech industry, where there's less competition and more kind of a monopolistic market structure, there tends to be less interest in implementing a solution. And where there's more competition and more sort of interest in running a cleaner platform, so to speak, relative to your competitors, then there tends to be more proactive action. And so to us, that's also why, antitrust actions are actually an important lever to pull in the tech reform conversation as it relates to disinformation and extremism and hate speech, in addition to the other ones I've been talking about as well.
Thank you very much for that, for clearly outlining the challenges that we have before us. You mentioned that a lot of these large tech companies, and you really listed the who's who of major tech companies that have problems in carrying propaganda and selling some of this merchandise. The fact that they are based in the United States and have United States laws applying to how they govern themselves, you mentioned the platform liability waiver. What kind of a challenge does that present to a country like Canada, where the companies are not based in our country? How does the Canadian government face this challenge when it's dealing with foreign-based companies? And to what extent is the global community of nations confronting this problem? And what more should our country be doing to put this on the international spotlight to really get international partners to effectively deal with it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I will be honest, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know that I can give you a perfect answer, other than to say, so I don't know the details of how, say, liability laws in Canada would apply to platforms, that are headquartered in the United States. I would say that Canada can certainly join the EU and the rest of the world in leading the regulatory conversation with in the EU, for example, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Safety Act, in the UK, the Online Safety Bill. These are examples of leading conversations, and then providing international pressure to the United States to follow along and take legislative action as well are, I think, two things that can certainly help.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, looking at the clock and the division of time, if I cut everybody in half in this coming round, we'll end within 5 minutes of on time. So, with that stricture, let me turn to Mr. Lloyd with 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My 2.5 minutes. My question for Mr. Gosselin, something that you said really struck to me is that one of the root causes is that people feel that they no longer have a place in society. And I'm wondering, as an expert in the prevention of radicalization leading to violence, have you ever found that calling people names or labeling people has been an effective tool to prevent radicalization?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Indeed, when I spoke about polarizing discourse and debates, labeling, name-calling, as you put it, is often a factor that will accentuate this feeling of marginalization and being excluded. And sometimes people become more aggressive, of course, when discussions get heated and people start to call each other names. But we should also make the distinction between debating ideas and attacking individuals and their own root identity.
Absolutely. I think, it is important to denounce hate, but you would say, people in positions of authority, you'd say it'd be very irresponsible of them to, it'd be contributing to radicalization to label people, as racists or misogynists. You don't think that would do anything to help prevent radicalization?
Well, one needs to strike a balance, of course, calling things for what they are. There are people who are racist. There are people who are misogynist. And you have to name those things and call them out when that's what they are. But it has to be based in fact, doesn't it? And one needs to strike a balance in political debate and in the public discourse. And the onus is on each and every politician to determine where he or she draws the line, isn't it?
Absolutely agree. I think it's very important not to, try to label entire groups. I mean, there's definitely individuals who do things that are heinous. That should be pointed out. But you would also agree, I guess, quickly that we need to reach out to these people to try to bring them back into the fold. Would you agree with that? To bring them back into society?
That's going to have to be a yes or no.
Yes. Yes. Dialogue's always important.
Move to Mr. Zuberi. Mr. Zuberi, you have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And I'd like to start with Mr. Gosselin, if I may. I attended a number of your info sessions of your centre as a stakeholder, and I really have a great deal of respect for the work that you do. On your website, you state that there are 4 types of radicalisation: far-right extremism, political and religious extremism, left-wing extremism, and single-cause extremism. Could you please tell us what percentage of the resources of your centre is dedicated to each category, please? Response. Thank you very much, Mr. Dubré. Well, it's a bit tough on the spot to answer that question, especially since I don't have access to all the confidential information of those folks who do call in. We tried to deal with all extremists in a fair and equitable way, so to speak. Now, when our centre was set up, we focused on the jihad movement, and with the rise of the far right, well, we've also been focusing over the last couple of years more heavily on that, on the conspiracy theory movement, which falls into the single unique cause category. But we know that the far left has, over the years, had a sizable footprint in Canada as well as worldwide, just like other movements. So we try to develop a preventative framework that works across all ideologies, all categories, because radicalization sees no borders in that sense.
And I just like, for context, I'd like to point out that your center started in the context, a very robust conversation around jihadi extremism, for lack of a better term. Is that correct? And therefore, initially, your work was focused around that, but I do believe you made a sincere and concerted effort to broaden and not to be pigeonholed in that way. Is that correct, Mr. Gosselin?
Well, the centre was created as a result of the Syrian crisis, and that helped to convince us of the need to create the centre. But right from the outset, understood. Well, right from the outset, we've been clear in our mandate that radicalisation isn't limited to political Islam or jihadism. Could be any ideology. Ms. Larouche.
1.25 minutes. Make best you can out of that.
Écoutez rapidement.
Well, listen, very quickly then. Mr. Gosselin, we'll come back to the question that I asked at the tail end of my previous round. What are the main factors of radicalisation that were observed at the start of the pandemic, by way of conclusion? First, anxiety in the face of the crisis, which was exploited by certain ideologically driven groups who have tried to push a number of conspiracy theories and alternative, quote-unquote, alternative ideas in a populist way against the quote-unquote elite. And that was one of the major factors, as well as a host of social factors that have pushed people into extremism and backed people into extremist corners. And what about the media? Has it contributed as well? Well, obviously, yes, disinformation, fake news further accentuates radicalisation, and obviously that's a far broader issue to deal with.
Mr. McGregor, you also have 1.25 minutes. Good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rogers, on your organization's website, there's a blog post from January the 10th of this year titled Happy 2022, or is it? If you worry democracy itself was under attack in 2021, you may want to sit 2022 out. I don't have a lot of time, but if you could just maybe expand on that blog post and relating to disinformation and its threat to democracy.
Sure. There was also a question earlier about what is at stake here, and I would say exactly what my co-founder and I outlined in that blog post, that what we're seeing is a convergence of all of the different specific narratives that we've been tracking into this larger anti-democratic and frankly anti-enlightenment kind of narrative, whether it's anti-science, anti-government. And I think that's really been apparent in the recent Ukraine conflict, for example, where we've really seen these anti-democratic narratives come to the forefront.
Thank you very much. I'll end there.
We move now to you for 2.5 minutes, whenever you're ready.
Oh, Mr. Chair, were you talking to me?
Yes. You have 2.5 minutes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much. I really appreciated a lot of the testimony. And Mr. Gosselin, I found some of your testimony was quite compelling, or much of it. But in particular, you mentioned that, I'm just quoting the English translation of what you said, I believe it, feelings of being marginalized influenced extremism, people who feel like they no longer have a place in society, and that can lead to radicalization. And you mentioned that this needs to be dealt with seriously by legislators. Is that a correct assessment of your position?
Oui, absolutely.
I was thinking about that in the context. The convoy has been mentioned a number of times in terms of this study. And I'm wondering how that applies of how we've treated the unvaccinated. We've effectively cut them out of public life in many ways. Do you feel that that is marginalizing those individuals? Does that fit the bill? And could that lead to the more extremist views we may be seeing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a sensitive issue. There are public health issues, of course, and we're talking about an infectious disease. So personal choice of getting vaccinated or not under those circumstances has broad ramifications on all of society writ large. But indeed, one does get the sense in some debates that those who've refused to get vaccinated, especially in the early stages, were demonized, were ridiculized, and that did lead to further radicalization in some cases. Now, public discourse has changed since then. We talk now about vaccination hesitation, about convincing people to go and get vaccinated rather than punishing them or beating them over the head with it. But both here and Canada, and we've seen this elsewhere as well in the world, there has been over-polarization, which has led to further radicalization in some cases, yes.
So what are the best steps forward to bringing marginalized, and I don't want to get there, but I mean, if we continue to marginalize a group of people, and this can apply to anything, not just the pandemic, but if we continue to keep them out of society, would that not feed the idea that you've put forward about further radicalizing people?
Probablement, oui.
Probably, yes. We advise dialogue at all levels, at all occasions, both politically and also at a community and a grassroots level. Those are the kinds of methods that keep a dialogue and conversations open, even when there is strong disagreement on particular ideas.
Mr. Zuberi, I'll ask you to finish off this round. You have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
I'd like to go to Mr. Rogers. You spoke about 250 social media accounts, if I'm correct, 73 sites, many other aspects of the internet that deal with radicalization and hate. Do you think that social media companies have a role to play in this? And if so, at this point in time, their algorithms are not manifest to legislators. Do you think it would be helpful if those algorithms did become manifest to legislators? Just on those 2 points, please.
Yeah, I think certainly they have a huge role to play. And in fact, if you think about, why we talk about this now and we weren't talking about this 20 years ago, it's not that radical people didn't exist, it's that social media companies and their algorithmic amplification engines didn't exist. These are algorithms that individually warp the realities of between Facebook and YouTube and TikTok, well over half the world's population at this point. And I emphasize both in the words individually and warp. I think there's a lot of talk about algorithmic transparency, and I certainly think having more light shown on these algorithms would certainly help the conversation along as to what we do about them. But I also don't think it's particularly opaque what these algorithms are supposed to do, which is drive engagement on these platforms at the cost of everything else. And so, we don't need to look under the hood to know that that's the goal. And these as products, as I said, the at the cost of everything else is really where the key point is that these companies have made sort of historic amounts of money, achieved unprecedented market capitalization on these algorithms, these sort of secret weapons of theirs, and have had to put no consideration into the negative consequences, the harms caused by these algorithms. And due to these liability waivers. And so I think that's really where the focus is, and transparency will certainly help the conversation. But ultimately we do need action.
Thank you. And just very quick follow-up. You described basically the Wild West of the internet with respect to online hate. Do you think that there needs to be some guidance from legislators around that?
Do you mean, do legislators have a role to play in this? Absolutely.
Yes.
Please. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's where the most important levers are, frankly. That I think it's become crystal clear that these companies aren't going to act, of their own volition, and certainly the role of legislators around the world is what's going to force a change.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of members of the committee, I would like to thank the witnesses for some fascinating testimony over the last hour. We appreciate your sacrifice of time for the good of this committee, and on behalf of all of parliamentarians, thank you so much for your testimony today. Colleagues, we take a very short break, like a minute or two. We move into camera, and we've got most of an hour to finish some very important work. So we will reconvene in 2 minutes.